Hello, welcome back. I'm very glad to be here, and today I want to talk about criticisms towards Playboy as a brand as well as participants in Playboy magazine, and how I feel that based on what I've seen online, criticisms have not been through a very victim-focused lens. So I want to explain what that means and talk a little bit more about why I think that people don't understand the nuance of the criticisms here. I have a lot of thoughts about the women of Playboy, the criticisms they receive, as well as this idea that somehow everyone knew at the time of Playboy's peak and really throughout Playboy's existence that Playboy was a toxic company and that anybody who participated knew what they were getting into. And that's just not true. Much of the criticism surrounding participants in Playboy that were harmed during their time is that they knew what they were getting into and that they deserved it for walking in with open eyes. But Playboy as a brand did and still does pull the wool over our eyes. So Hugh Hefner was working for Esquire magazine before starting Playboy, and he was, by the way he tells it, inspired to start it because his wife cheated on him. And by the way he tells this story, he calls it the most devastating moment in his life. And listen, I was gonna say I'm not gonna judge him for feeling bad that he was cheated on, but I'm gonna judge him with context. So I'm just gonna say that based on what we know now about Hugh Hefner, it's like, not only do I not believe that was the most devastating thing in his life, but it's like one blow to the ego, and this is what you do, dude. A lot of people just take that and keep going, alright? So he decides to stop writing for Esquire as a copywriter, and then he gets a loan and starts Playboy. But to start, he needed something to get people's attention, and nothing gets people's attention more than celebrity nudes, so he bought Marilyn Monroe's nudes from a Chicago advertising agency. This article calls it an advertising firm, but others call it a calendar company, like here where it says Baumgarth Calendar Company, and in this other article where it says Western Lithograph Company. Looks like it was a printing company that at one point sold ads in their work. Hefner and others knew of a calendar where Marilyn Monroe was topless, but only a small number of people had ever actually seen it since it had been out of print. So Hefner contacted the printer to get his hands on the original photos. Marilyn Monroe is someone who never interacted with the Playboy brand or Hugh Hefner specifically because she was against the use of her photos to begin his magazine and to be in the magazine at all. So obviously, not receiving the person's consent that you put right on the cover of your sexual men's magazine is absolutely disgusting, and it's not something that he just did once. Maybe you've heard that story before, or maybe you haven't, but maybe you've heard of Vanna White's story, or Paris Hilton, Brooke Shields. Something Playboy did successfully was convince women that they were safe and empowered within the walls and pages of Playboy. But let's look at the actual magazine content for a second, because I read it for the articles was a big joke, right? Authors like Ray Bradbury, Margaret Atwood, Shel Silverstein, Jack Kerouac, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez were all included and published within the pages of Playboy. So that does give the magazine a lot of notoriety, a lot of credibility. Not only that, Dick Cheney once published a tirade against Obama, and it's like, oh my god, Playboy also frequently interviewed celebrities, and those interviews were kind of hailed as the more journalistic aspect of the magazine. They would interview important people, right? They would interview people like Miles Davis, Vladimir Nabokov, Malcolm X, Ralph Nader was interviewed. He also wrote for them once in 2018, and it's like, there are many, many A-listers that still around today have been on the pages of Playboy, inside, on the cover. But in spite of how many people were willing to pose and were eager to be on the pages of Playboy, that was not enough for Hugh Hefner. Vanna White once posed. She was a model for lingerie in a photo shoot, and this was about 5 years before her career on Wheel of Fortune really took off. Hugh Hefner bought those photos from the photographer and then told her about it. She met with him and begged him not to publish the photos. This man tells her, he looks her in her eyes and says, "It's just money, of course, anything for you, friend." Then, in 1987, the month before she's set to release her memoir, Hugh Hefner calls her and says, "It's out of my hands, it's gonna be published next month with your memoir." That is That is some vile shit. Anyway, so Vanna White decides to sue Playboy for this, and all she's attempting to do with these lawsuits are to prevent the publication of those photos specifically. What ends up happening is there's so much promotion around the magazine, the photos, and of course the lawsuits. She drops them entirely, and her statement on this was that as part of Playboy's promotion efforts, they have led the public to believe that the photos are far more provocative than they really are. And she was worried that by not publishing those photos, people would simply, their imagination would run wild. The point was that she never posed nude, and she was fighting a losing battle, essentially. She still feels like she was kind of in a terrible situation when she took those photos at all. She said that she did it because she needed money at the time. And what really bothers me is that Vanna White, someone who was a Wheel of Fortune blonde woman kind of jumping and clapping when people won, like that is her job, and it is in the job description that you look a certain way. So she was never going to get the role that she had on Wheel of Fortune without being a beautiful woman, right? Without being a woman with a certain body type. And what's super annoying is that, like, yeah, she's in a dress in Wheel of Fortune and, like, jumping up and down, clapping, but, all of a sudden she's in her underwear in a few pictures and it's just, like, horrible, awful, right? But I also think the point was she specifically didn't want those photos in Playboy, which not only increased their distribution in the first place, right? No longer is it just this set of photos it didn't really describe the nature of the shoot, like if it was some kind of an advertisement, so let's say it was an advertisement, but no longer is it the audience of the people who saw the advertisement in that time. Now it is an increased audience. Circulation definitely, at this time, still could have been in the millions. But shortly after, So, it is the wide distribution of those photos in a magazine with more explicit photos that already makes it seem as if those photos, her own, were going to be explicit as well. And it's really gross because I feel that so many women are not allowed to participate in their own sexuality, only to be sexualized by others. Okay, here's the thing. He said it was out of his hands. He wasn't CEO in 1987 because in 1984, he made his daughter a COO, Chief Operating Officer, and then in 1987, by that time, she was Chief Executive Officer. And I just want to say that if you really think he couldn't have just told his daughter, don't run this, that she wouldn't have run it, it's ridiculous. It's a farce. It's amazing that he could just turn on a dime and feel nothing about it. A very kind Playboy collector let me look through their magazines so that I could check out some articles from some specific dates, and the month after the Vanna White photos were published in the magazine, Playboy actually received letters to the editors talking about how Vanna White did not want those photos in Playboy. The reader was bringing up great points and even suggesting to Playboy that it was kind of beneath them to publish photos that were more like tabloid photos. And yet, the response that this person got in return that was also published in the magazine here was very condescending. And it was harping on points that didn't even matter, honestly, to the actual thing that we're talking about here. Saying things like, no, the quality of photos is still good. Yeah, no, it's perfectly fine. I think you're gonna love it. The response also chooses to nitpick Vanna White's story about how she was financially insecure at the time of posing for the photo shoot, and they decide to debate that point by saying that Vanna White was fine. She didn't need the money. She wanted to pose. Obviously, by this point, many of us have seen the kind of snake oil version of empowerment that involves buying this specific makeup product or this certain kind of clothing. So, if we can understand that that doesn't automatically empower us, that doesn't grant us independence or free speech or anything really, really important, right? It doesn't make us more beautiful, but it also does not define our self-worth. We can also understand that sexualization is not automatically empowering, which really did seem kind of like the Playboy motto, where they wanted these women to be posing and to be sexual most of the time, right? But they didn't want to establish boundaries or let those women establish boundaries that would have been empowering. And as much as Playboy and Hugh Hefner himself get praised a lot for his support of LGBTQ rights, something that we have to remember is his own statements about his strong beliefs in essential distinctions between men and women and how they play different roles in society, and how he believes women should still look like women, they should still be women in his idea, his version of a woman, and he has a really narrow definition of women and women's sexuality. So, for the Read It for the Articles crowd, Hugh Hefner really did attempt to put a lot of intellectualism into this work. He wanted to include those hefty articles next to, obviously, these nude photos, because it's kind of like giving somebody sugar with medicine. And I think something really insidious about what Hugh Hefner did was he tied intellectualism into this, his version of a sexual revolution, where it made a lot of women uncomfortable in that if they did not choose to explore their sexuality or if they refused specific sexual acts, there was a lot of judgment on his part about how they weren't willing to be open towards something so meaningful, right? Something so revolutionary. And that's a really cruel, awful thing to do. It's extremely manipulative, and it's a defining feature of many cults as well. Some of his past ex-girlfriends, such as Holly Madison, Sandra Theodore, and Crystal Hefner, his ex-wife, have spoken out about the cult-like atmosphere at the mansion where it was encouraged only to speak very highly of Hugh Hefner and to gush about the Playboy brand. Now, Hugh Hefner's definition of an ideal woman, or specifically the woman that he wanted on the pages of Playboy, was something he called the girl next door, which was someone that could be your neighbor, right? Or he also said that this was the new secretary in the office, right? Someone that you've seen around, a service worker that is doing their job, being nice to you. And then also describe them as a bunny as well, where they have to be a little shy, but they're innocent, virginal, and it's like, holy Christ, that is so gross. It's really about submissiveness as well as kind of this really gross, hyper-fundy Christian notion that you should be virginal, right, and untouched. Again, coming from a magazine that wants to promote sexuality, they also want people that specifically aren't porn stars or models that were doing nude photos before. It's extremely hypocritical, and something that Hugh Hefner, with his own girlfriends, he didn't want strippers or people that have been in porn, theoretically, even though that is exactly who he did end up dating several times. They would just kind of like hide it from him. And it's pretty gross because it's very obvious. It's like they didn't want powerful women to be the ones featured. They didn't want women that were on their own and fine in their own sexuality, right? Kind of like the Playboy. He tried to come up with the concept of a Playgirl that was like single, sexual, wanted to, like, let's say, be with many people, wasn't necessarily looking to settle down and get married. And that's fine, but it's also never actually something that he talked about or encouraged or featured within the magazine. It's always like someone submissive to men, someone that, let's say, you have more control over, someone that you could theoretically dominate, especially in a space where, let's say, they're your secretary. And he would put, eventually, his own secretary on the cover of Playboy taking nude photos because he decided to date her. And it wasn't even uncommon for men to date their secretaries in the offices of Playboy. It's just like, oh yeah, we're all about women's rights, equality in the workplace, etc., except when we're horny. Now, I put together a little timeline of the big events in Playboy history and the things that they did contribute to, social movements, for example, people that graced their covers, as well as big controversies, to put it all together for you and just show you that every decade definitely had several cultural attitudes surrounding the brand. From 1953 to 1960. So to start, in 1953, Playboy was founded by Hugh Hefner, and the very first magazine sold very well because of the feature of Marilyn Monroe's nude photos. Now, Marilyn Monroe never acknowledged him in her life and certainly didn't want those photos in the magazine, which I think significantly contributed to his obsession with her throughout his life, frequently calling people like Pamela Anderson and Anna Nicole Smith, calling them the next Marilyn Monroe. Now, again, I believe that this is the reason for his obsession. He is currently buried next to her, interred in a mausoleum, I believe. You know, that thing where it kind of looks like drawers. So, constantly trying to bother this woman, I swear to God. For him, it's always the thrill of the unattainable, and he never admired the women he dated with this much energy. Anyway, in 1955, something significant was that Playboy published a story. It's called The Crooked Man. I read it, and again, for the time, it is something new. It is something revolutionary, you could say, because what it was a story about a straight man living in a world where only gay couples were allowed, right? It was kind of an inversion on what was already happening in 1955, the persecution of gay people. So instead it was, what if there was a persecution of straight people? And now you and me today, if we were given this story in 2023, it might come off more like some homophobic fantasy of, look, the gays are trying to take over and this is what that's going to look like. But genuinely in 1955, I think using that kind of rhetoric that was used against gay people was eye-opening, but it also played on gay panic and like the fear of gay men being sexually aggressive, which, if I want to give the author credit, could be obviously just attempting to make the point and drive it home a little harder. It's just kind of like, this is what you're doing, and obviously if you're afraid of it happening to you, then clearly maybe it's not something justifiable, and that's the same thing that Hugh Hefner said. At the time the story was published, it was also illegal in the US to participate in consensual sodomy, so that was what they were working with, and it took until 1962 for Illinois to become the first state to revoke that law. Although that would not be the end for anti-sodomy laws in the US. They are still very much relevant today. This was also the era during McCarthyism, where the Lavender Scare was taking people out of their homes, out of their careers, and ruining their lives, imprisoning them. In some cases, they were being treated as if they were mentally ill. In 1955, Playboy stops using professional models as centerfolds, and this is coincidentally the year that Janet Pilgrim, his secretary, was featured as the centerfold. And perhaps also coincidentally, Hugh Hefner began dating Janet Pilgrim during this time. But of course, Playboy magazine definitely still included outdated misogynistic humor, like rape jokes, frequently amongst their comics and joke sections. This specific example is from 1992, but it's only because there are some unsubstantiated images on the internet of comics earlier than that, and I didn't want to use a comic that I couldn't find a proper attribution for. And 1960 saw the very first opening of a Playboy club in Chicago. Now from 1961 to 1970, this decade was where Playboy was growing significantly, and it did have a lot of cultural relevance. This era was also filled with an extreme political environment, and clearly in 1968, several historical events happening at once. And during this time, Playboy is on record as supporting abortion, gay rights, and civil rights. They also published articles and interviews with Martin Luther King, James Baldwin, and Malcolm X. This is also a time where feminism and feminists start to clash with Playboy more often, and are becoming louder, protesting against this idea that women can be reduced to bunnies, which is an overtly sexual animal that can't consent, right? We're kind of like simplifying, objectifying, overly sexualizing women. It was a critique of the male gaze, right? Which, this is something that Margaret Atwood actually talked about and has a very famous quote about as well, which I'm including here, as well as a quick definition of the male gaze. It's kind of odd. I don't know, like Margaret Atwood, I'm sure, has her reasons for publishing within Playboy. And again, everybody here, I believe, was misled by the intentions stated within Playboy and by Playboy itself. The marketing machine was huge, so to say that everybody knew that Playboy was extremely toxic and that it was always like harmful to women is so ahistorical. It's just very clearly there were many people supporting this magazine and lending it a lot of credibility. Jimmy Carter was interviewed, So in 1963, this is when Gloria Steinem decides to go undercover in a journalistic effort to record how women were treated within the Playboy clubs. And what she did was she went to an audition where they were hiring for Playboy bunnies, and the bunny mother, that was what they called them, who auditioned her, basically just measured her, looked at her, and was like, okay, whatever, you got the job. And then fit her for the costume, which they had to pay for. They had to pay for their costumes, cleaning the costumes themselves. They had to pay for the shoes and the leggings that were also required. Ridiculous stuff. But she gets that job, but she's subject to gynecological exam before she can actually enter the club and start working, which is like... what kind of a job subjects you to a gyno exam? It was so obvious. Like, why why they would ask the women working in their clubs to do that. And there was even a little bunny handbook about things that they were supposed to do and, like, not do, what to wear, what not to wear. And one of the things it said was no fraternizing with key holders, right? And it's just like, you know, you got like a little dumb key if you were a member of the Playboy Club. And that, there was an exception to that rule in that if they were a VIP, it was encouraged for you to, like, be all over them. So the Playboy bunnies also worked for tips, and they had a demerit system where the the bunny mother could just, like, file up a little report about how their costume was dirty, or, like, they didn't stuff their bra enough, stuff like that, and that would affect their pay. This reporting was huge, especially for the feminist movement, because feminists took this as kind of the evidence that these Playboy clubs were exploiting women and were more harmful than they were helpful. And this was actually Gloria Steinem's first, like, feminist act of activism specifically. But she later wrote that she regretted this being, at the very least, her first act because it labeled her as a bunny. People weren't taking her seriously for her journalistic efforts because she was able to be hired as a Playboy bunny, because she passed that test of, like, standard attractiveness or whatever they were using. She all of a sudden was just, like, tainted by Playboy, and it's just so stupid. And in spite of Gloria Steinem's publication of this article, in 1967, Time magazine called Hugh Hefner clean, respectable, and trustworthy. Yikes. In 1963, Playboy was also able to interview Jimmy Hoffa before he was disappeared, and also Malcolm X. And in 1965, Jennifer Jackson becomes the first black Playmate. Unlike other Playmates, she was not sent out on college tours or promotions like other Playmates were because, as Hefner said, he had no way of protecting her. This might be the most honest he was with any Playmate, but maybe he should have said that he had no interest in protecting her. In 1969, Hugh Hefner decides to buy a personal jet, and he calls it the Big Bunny, and his plan was to make a Playboy mansion in an airplane. In January 1970, Jean Bell becomes the first black woman to appear on the cover of Playboy magazine, however she appears with 3 other women. Also kind of Mike Wazowski'd her by putting her literally on the binding. In 1969, Playboy After Dark airs for the first time. It was a late-night TV show whose premise was to appear as if you were at a party with Hugh Hefner. Hefner's mingling and invitations of black celebrities, musicians, guests was very progressive in a time when many still opposed integration. But in 1970, Playboy After Dark is cancelled. An August 1970 issue of Playboy also included an article called Just Slip This Into Her Drink, encouraging the use of aphrodisiacs in a woman's drink and food, and also suggests the use of alcohol to help lower a woman's defenses. And I'm writing this because it's notable that Bill Cosby and Hugh Hefner were, like, best buddies throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s. Even the journalistic efforts of Playboy, the interviews that were so lauded and celebrated, were also mired in these misogynistic comments. Like when Janis Joplin was interviewed and she stood up and the interviewer made a note about being able to see her panties. Just like... In 1969, actress Sharon Tate is murdered by the Manson family members, and Sharon Tate was also married to director Roman Polanski at this time. And Roman Polanski also happens to be a very good friend of Hugh Hefner, and in 1970, Hefner funded Roman Polanski's movie Macbeth. Hugh Hefner was also very good friends with Woody Allen. Now from 1971 to 1980, in 1972, the first movie feature pornographic film Deep Throat was released, and the main star was a woman going by Linda Lovelace, who was abused and manipulated into that film by her boyfriend Chuck Traynor. Linda writes about this in her novel Ordeal, and she talks about how she was made to go to the Playboy Mansion, and under the guise of her wanting to be there and participating, she was assaulted, and Hugh Hefner was there to witness it. This is a bit of a peak for Playboy, and in 1973 there were about 7 million Playboy magazines in circulation. This is the highest number of magazines in circulation Playboy ever gets to. That same year, in comparison, Cosmopolitan had around 1,800,000 magazines in circulation, while Esquire had 1.25 million magazines in circulation. While Playboy centerfolds were simply topless before 1973, 1973 was the year that Playboy introduced full frontal nudity with Marilyn Cole. Also in 1973, the first issue of Playgirl is on the stands, which is not a Playboy publication at all, which surprised me. It is a publication made by Douglas Lambert, who was inspired by his wife Jenny when she gave him the idea of a magazine that was similar to Playboy but for women. And I'm sure I'll have to get back to this later because Playgirl has a bit of an explosive history on its own as well. And in 1974, Playmate Paige Young kills herself and leaves behind a message on her wall saying Hugh Hefner is the devil. She also names John Huston as an abuser in her suicide note. Paige's suicide was pretty well buried until about 2014, and even then only the Daily Mail had written an article about this event. Paige's good friends are included in the documentary Secrets of Playboy, and they do describe the events leading up to her suicide as well as her mental state. The person who found her body as well as the message she left is also interviewed in that documentary. In 1975, a woman named Bobby Arnstein, who was Hefner's social secretary, was found dead by apparent overdose in her apartment. Hugh Hefner was being investigated by the DEA for alleged drug parties as well as conspiracy to distribute and traffic cocaine. Bobby Arnstein was arrested with half a pound of cocaine in her bag and then charged and given 15 years in prison for conspiring to transport cocaine from Miami to Chicago. In Hugh Hefner's words, the DEA had been putting such immense pressure on Bobby Arnstein to testify against him that she was driven to suicide. But when we think about all of the playmates and past girlfriends that have come forward to say how many drugs were at the mansion and how cocaine was encouraged to be used for partying as well as staying skinny, it seems ridiculously hard to believe that Hugh Hefner would have nothing to do with that. In fact, past girlfriends like Sandra Theodore have said that he had his own personal stash, fully stocked at all times, and Bobby Arnstein was the one who brought it to him. Allegedly, of course, as well as an allegation that another young Playboy bunny named Adrienne Pollock was traveling with Bobby Arnstein frequently and acting as a drug mule to Hugh Hefner. Allegedly. Sadly, Adrienne Pollock had died of a drug overdose, an overdose on Quaaludes, in 1973. And later in 1975, in a move that I'm sure is not connected in any way at all to the possibility of drug charges, Hugh Hefner decides to sell the Big Bunny jet to Aeromexico. In 1977, Roman Polanski is tried for the rape of a 13-year-old girl and flees to France. And from Secrets of Playboy, we found that past girlfriends and friends of Hugh Hefner stated that he didn't think what Roman Polanski did was wrong at all. In 1978, 6 women working in the Great Gorge Playboy Resort as bunnies were held hostage by 5 men who told them that they were producers filming a TV show that needed extras. They were held and tortured for 2 days and then blackmailed with the photographs and videos. The men were charged for their crimes, and the Playboy Resort in Great Gorge did actually create more restrictions, especially regarding when and where the bunnies could travel to and what guest areas they could be in. And in 1980, Dorothy Stratton, who was a Playmate of the Year in the late 70s, was murdered by her boyfriend. And this is somebody that Hugh Hefner did personally know, and he was made aware of as well because he was a dangerous person. Now for 1981 to 1990. In 1981, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, Playmate Rebecca Armstrong, at 22 years old, was diagnosed with AIDS, and later given a platform by Playboy to talk about AIDS awareness. Playboy magazine never shied away from talking about the AIDS epidemic and also talked about sexual health and safety. The 1980s saw several celebrities gracing the cover of Playboy, including Madonna, Drew Barrymore, and Bo Derek. Hugh Hefner is still facing a lot of backlash from feminists, and in 1984 decides to appoint his daughter as chief operating officer, and by 1987 she is the chief executive officer. This is also a time where legal scrutiny on Playboy is at an all-time high, especially after Dorothy Stratton's murder. Christy Hefner decides to shut down the Playboy clubs that had already been losing money by that point, and she begins Playboy TV as well as Playboy.com. However, in 1985, a book released by Peter Bogdanovich was released called The Killing of the Unicorn, Dorothy Stratton, 1960-1980, and this book was about her murder as well as the events leading up to it. In this book, Peter Bogdanovich alleges that Hugh Hefner sexually assaulted Dorothy Stratton. Hugh Hefner is said to, in reaction to this book, have had a stroke in 1985, which he credits to him wanting to get married and settle down after. This is also Reagan era when conservatism starts coming kind of full force, and there's an anti-obscenity movement, which obviously includes Playboy. And many people thought that the 1980s was the end for Playboy. In 1986, Hugh Hefner is dating Carrie Lee, who is accused of sexually assaulting a minor. That minor is Jennifer Saganor, who is the daughter of Hugh Hefner's personal doctor, Mark Saganor. And personal doctors are kind of strange because in Los Angeles, they're viewed as a celebrity concierge for medication, more like. And Hugh Hefner is someone who is known during the early 2000s as well as the 80s and 90s to have distributed Quaaludes to his girlfriends and people he was partying with as a recreational drug. Quaaludes also, if you can remember, were notably a part of the Bill Cosby case because that is what he would use on his victims. So there is a belief that perhaps Mark Saganor was the one able to supply him in this way, or personal doctors in general. Mark Saganor was more than a personal doctor. He was more like an extremely close friend, at least according to his daughter Jennifer, who Hef credited with saving his life in 1985 after his stroke. In her book Playground, as well as the Secrets of Playboy documentary, Jennifer Saganor also alleges that her father and men like her father that were around Hugh Hefner would set up their own mini versions of the Playboy Mansion, where they would have fake modeling agencies and photo shoots in order to lure vulnerable women back to their houses and assault them. In 1986, Attorney General Edwin Meese created the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography in an attempt to link violent crime to pornography in society. The report was 2,000 pages long and included testimony even from former Playmate Mickey Garcia, who also testified to the rampant drug abuse in the mansion as well. As a result of the recommendations made in this report, Playboy, Hustler, and any other sexually implicit or explicit magazines that were sold in convenience stores, grocery stores, etc. had to be covered. You've probably seen it with like a plastic divider. Many people were against the Meese Commission as well as the report at all because it made recommendations that would allow the government to prosecute those who distribute obscene materials or materials that they deem obscene more easily. In 1989, Hugh Hefner marries Kimberly Conrad, who was also a Playmate, a Playboy model. They have 2 kids together, Cooper and Marston, and this is in addition to Hugh Hefner's kids from his first marriage, David and Christy. So many women were Playmates first and then became Hef's girlfriend that it was a little odd. Odd to me, at least, because I think that it seems very obviously like exploitation when the editor-in-chief is sleeping with every cover of the magazine, every woman that poses nude in the magazine, at least for several decades, and he admits to it freely. He has an entire book called the Playmate book, where he will make notes about every Playmate, right? Especially some of the more significant ones, the more popular ones. And his notes will include how they were partners in an affair, lovers at one point. And it's like, whoa, no, I don't like that. And in 1990, Donald Trump is on the cover of Playboy. From 1991 to 2000. Now, in 1990 and 1991, Hugh Hefner saw the birth of his 2 sons, Marston and Cooper, with Kimberly Conrad. And during this decade, he's more of a stay-at-home father kind of person. And the parties are less at Playboy. Kimberly Conrad and starts enforcing a bit more rules and less guests at the house. It's also at this time that the advent of online porn is all over the place, so Playboy has a lot more competition. In 1994, Christy Hefner says no to buying out Playgirl when they are in danger of going bankrupt. In 1998, Hugh Hefner separates from Kimberly Conrad, but waits until about 2010 to actually divorce. And in 2000, he starts dating Bentley twins, Mandy and Sandy Bentley, and Brandy Roderick. Dating twins, Mandy and Sandy, as well as dating 3 women at once, just kind of set off an era of him dating multiple women at once, and this attracted a lot of media attention, but also the speculation that it was more for show than anything else. This is somebody who has dated women before and is known as being a womanizer, but he's also known for, at least at one point, or 2 points, getting married. So they didn't take it very seriously, let's say. Even though amongst women, and especially amongst his girlfriends, it was well known that he would be sleeping with multiple women at one time, dating them, but still only calling one his girlfriend. now from 2001 to 2010. This is his era of having 7 girlfriends at once. He called them the party posse, which just sounds like an old man thing in general.